domain of a function. Domain of a function is all of the x values associated with that function. So all the x values. So the question that you're asking yourself is, what can I plug into the function? What can I plug into the function? What x values can I plug in? So for example, if you have a linear function like y equals 3x plus 1, you can plug in any number you want for x. Every number you plug in, all those numbers are called the domain, and the values that you get out, the y values, are called the range. So we're focusing on the domain right now. What can I plug into this function? And the answer is that you can plug in anything you want. You could plug a 5 in, you would get 3 times 5 is 15, plus 1 is 16. So 5 is your input, 16 is your output. When you plug in 5, you get 16. So what can you plug in here? Anything you want. You could plug in 100. 3 times 100 is 300, plus 1 is 301. So the domain of the function is all real numbers. Another function is called a quadratic function. What can you plug in here? Any value you want. If you plug in a 10 and you square it, you get 100. So your input is 10, your output is 100. You could plug in 50, you could plug in negative 5. You plug in negative 5 and you square it, you get 25. So your input, the number you plug in, or your domain, is all real numbers. And most often it is all real numbers. Most functions you can plug in anything you want. So when you're asked what is the domain of the function, most often the answer is going to be all real numbers. However, rational functions are when it's in the form of a fraction, like this. 5 over x minus 6. So again, you're asking yourself, if you're making one of these tables, what can I plug in for x? So for example, you could plug in, let me switch colors here, you could plug in 11. So when you plug in 11, you get 11 minus 6, which is 5, and 5 divided by 5 is 1. So your input is 11, your output is 1. 11 is part of your domain, 1 is part of your range. The domain is all the values that you can list. So you can plug in anything you want. You can plug in 12. 12 minus 6 is 6. And 5 divided by 6, you could write it like this. Or you could take a calculator and figure out what 5 6 equals. So you can plug in almost anything you want into this function. However, you cannot plug in 6 into this function, because when you do, you get 6 minus 6, which is 0. And 5 divided by 0 is no solution, because we learned in the previous video that you cannot divide by 0. So in this function, you can plug in any value you want, and every time you plug in a value, you'll get a y value with it, except when you plug in 6. So when you go to graph this function, something is going to happen at 6. There's a jump in the graph, which you'll learn about later on in the year. So you would say that the domain of this function is all real numbers except 6. So you can plug in any value you want except for 6. Let's look at another example here, a couple more. Y equals x minus 2 over 5. This is a rational function. However, you can plug in any number you want into this function. Technically, it's a linear function, because if you reduce this, it's 1/5 x minus 2/5. If you wrote it separately and gave them each their own denominator. So it's a linear function. So the domain is all real numbers. You can plug in anything you want into this function. Some people might make the mistake of saying, oh, you can't plug 2 in because 2 minus 2 is 0. But that's okay, because you'll get 0 over 5, which equals 0. So when you plug in 2, you get 0 for an answer. You can have 0 in the numerator, you just can't have it in the denominator, because you can't divide by 0. Okay? And one more example would be y equals 3x over 2x minus 6. If you were asked, what is the domain of this function? It doesn't matter what you plug in the numerator. However, this denominator cannot equal 0. 2x minus 6 cannot equal 0. because you can't have 0 in the denominator. So what will make this, if we do a little algebra here, or you could just logically think about it, figure it out. Divide by 2, x equals 3. So x cannot be 3, because if x were 3 and you tried to plug it in here, you'd say 2 times 3 is 6, and 6 minus 6 is 0, and you can't have 0 in the denominator. So therefore, the domain is all real numbers except 3. And you could see that here. Some of you didn't necessarily need to do all this work. But that's it. That's the domain of a function. All the values that you can plug in for x.